To unlock the next title, you need to get a total of 30 victories with alternative win condition. It is probably easiest to achieve this with Exodia deck. In fact, if you previously unlocked the Forbidden 1 title, you already made progress on this mission as well. But I decided to challenge myself with an old win condition that seems to have no place in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Final Countdown. Can it still be done in today's meta? Well, not if you are playing at the highest levels. But I found out that this deck is still playable in the Gold League. I knew that I set a difficult challenge for myself, but I still didn't realize just how difficult. On the surface, the win condition is straightforward. You activate the Final Countdown spell card, then find a way to stall your opponent for 20 turns. In modern Yu-Gi-Oh! This is quite difficult even in theory. In practice, this is even harder. All alternative win condition missions have the same problem. The opponent on a losing side of the duel could surrender, instead of waiting for your win condition. Playing Final Countdown deck is like watching paint dry, except it is also boring. This is also true for playing against Final Countdown. Many opponents will surrender upon realizing that they don't have a counter to your board. Even worse, some trolls will wait out the full 20 turns, then surrender, instead of ending their turn. Despite all these frustrations, with enough effort I managed to get some victories with this old alternative win condition. I was surprised by how effective is the Synchro Zone trap. Initially, my plan was to combine Synchro Zone with Vanity Fiend. Synchro Zone prevents my opponent from hitting me with anything but synchros. Vanity Fiend prevents the opponent from summoning synchros. However, since the modern meta also has a hefty share of decks that rely on fusion, Xyz, Link, or even no extra deck monsters at all, it can sometimes provide decent protection even before you find your copy of Vanity Fiend. Obviously, when you play Final Countdown deck, your first priority is to activate Final Countdown as soon as possible. I only have 2 copies of it, but I also added a searcher, 3 copies of Left Arm Offering. It is a very expensive card. The cost is to discard your entire hand, but it provides a universal spell searcher. I still don't know if 3 copies of Change of Heart is a good idea. The right combo didn't come up often enough. But this is its intended purpose: steal the opponent's monster to summon Vanity Fiend. If I was to play this deck again, I might have experimented with more combat floodgates instead of this. Many old effects were written with the assumption that every monster has a level. With the introduction of Xyz monsters and Link monsters into the game, this was no longer true, and that required some new rulings to reinterpret old rules. Effects such as Gravity Bind, that check the monster's level, leave completely unaffected monster cards that have ranks or ratings instead of levels. Note the power of Cauldron of the Old Man. Even though my opponent regularly hits me for 2000 points of damage per turn, he is not getting any closer to killing me off. Well, that's an unusual duel. My opponent didn't want to surrender, but also didn't want to wait 20 turns for the effect of Final Countdown. He tried to resolve this by ramming his monsters into my Vanity Fiend, but he also had Chicken Game on the field. The interesting effect of Chicken Game is that its effects can be used by both players. So I used it to heal my suicidal opponent. That's a demonstration of why trying to get final countdown victories is so incredibly frustrating. Many times, upon reaching turn 20, I found myself practically praying for my opponent to not surrender. And yet, there was about a 50-50 chance that I will get a win by surrender, instead of a special win condition. I can understand opponents who surrender early, upon realizing that they have no response to my board. But surrendering on move 20 is just trolling your opponent, cheating him out of an alternative win condition, and plenty of extra points in duel rewards. I didn't want to craft any rare or ultra-rare cards, because this is definitely not the deck I want to play regularly. This is the deck that I eventually put together. Obviously, your primary card is Final Countdown. I already had 2 copies, and decided I don't need to get a third. To get to Final Countdown faster, I also added 3 copies of Left Arm Offering. Left Arm Offering isn't exactly a card you see in normal meta, but it can be useful in weird decks that rely on a very specific setup for a win condition. As an added bonus, if I don't need it to get my final countdown, I can still find plenty of good uses for Left Arm Offering, such as Time-Tearing Morganite or another stall card. There are many different ways to stop my opponent from hitting me. You can't play Final Countdown any other way. 1 Messenger of Peace, 3 copies of Level Limit, Area B, 2 Gravity Binds and 1 Synchro Zone. You also need many other floodgates. Rivalry of Warlords, and there can be only one. Both serve the same purpose, limiting the opponent's summoning options. Vanity Fiend does the same thing, but from a monster zone instead of back row. And, of course, you want to limit the opponent's ability to use monster effects, which can be done both with Skill Drain and the Monarch's Erupt. Vanity Fiend plus Monarch's Erupt is a very nasty combo that stalls many decks. Add to that March of the Monarchs, and the opponent is powerless if he didn't pack some back row removal spells or traps. And just in case he did pack some of that, we also have 2 copies of the good old Solemn Judgment. And Cauldron of the Old Man is there to help us recover some health, in case the opponent gets around our combat floodgates. Another card that is not very useful in normal meta, but ends up being quite powerful in stall decks. I had a duel where an opponent resigned, because even when he was able to hit me with a strong monster every turn, I was regaining health faster than that.